Tito Ortiz versus Chuck Liddell. Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell weren't just rivals. They were former training partners and best friends who turned into bitter enemies, creating the most personal and devastating feud in UFC history. Their hatred was so real that it literally built the UFC into what it is today. These two men trained together at the same gym, partied together, and considered each other brothers. But when money, fame, and championship gold got involved, their friendship turned into something dark and personal that went way beyond professional competition. The hatred started when both men realized they were on a collision course for the light heavyweight title. What began as friendly competition between training partners slowly transformed into genuine animosity as the stakes got higher. Tito's trash talk became increasingly personal, attacking Chuck's lifestyle, his partying, and even his relationships. Chuck, who was normally laid back, started firing back with venom that shocked everyone who knew their history. The psychological warfare between these two was brutal. They knew each other's weaknesses, fears, and insecurities from years of training together, and they used that knowledge to hurt each other in ways that went beyond fighting. When they finally fought at UFC 47, the hatred was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Chuck's knockout of Tito wasn't just a victory, it was personal revenge that ended a friendship, created a rivalry that would define an era. The rematch at UFC 66 was even more vicious. Chuck's brutal knockout of Tito was the culmination of years of built-up hatred, and the way he celebrated showed just how personal this feud had become. What made this rivalry so compelling was that it was real. These weren't actors playing roles. These were two men who genuinely despised each other and wanted to hurt each other in the most public way possible. The Ortiz-Liddell feud proved that most compelling fights come from real hatred, not manufactured drama, and their rivalry literally saved the UFC from bankruptcy. By the way, if you think Tito and Chuck's hatred was intense, wait until you see what happened when family got involved in the next rivalry. Hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov created the most culturally explosive rivalry in UFC history, with McGregor's attacks on Khabib's religion, family, and country turning their feud into something that transcended sports and became a clash of civilizations. Their hatred began when McGregor started targeting everything Khabib held sacred: his Muslim faith, his Dagestani heritage, and his family's honor. What started as typical McGregor trash talk quickly escalated into something much darker and more personal. McGregor's attack on the bus at UFC 223 wasn't just about getting attention. It was a calculated assault designed to humiliate Khabib in front of his teammates and training partners. The broken glass and injuries showed that this had moved beyond professional rivalry. Khabib's response to McGregor's disrespect was rooted in his cultural and religious beliefs about honor and family. In Dagestani culture, the things McGregor was saying weren't just insults, they were declarations of war that demanded violent response. The press conferences leading up to their fight were filled with barely controlled rage from Khabib, who saw McGregor's comments about his father, his religion, and his country as unforgivable attacks on everything he represented. When they finally fought at UFC 229, Khabib wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to punish McGregor for what he saw as blasphemous disrespect. The ground and pound wasn't just fighting, it was retribution. The post-fight brawl that erupted after Khabib's victory showed that their hatred had infected their entire teams. This wasn't just about two fighters, it had become a cultural war between different worlds. McGregor's attacks on Khabib's wife, calling her a backwards cunt and mocking his religion, created hatred that went beyond anything seen in the UFC before. This was personal, cultural, and religious warfare. Khabib's promise to change his face wasn't just trash talk, it was a vow rooted in his cultural understanding of honor and the need to defend his family's reputation through violence. The McGregor-Khabib feud showed that when cultural, religious, and family honor get involved, hatred can reach levels that threaten to destroy not just careers, but entire communities and relationships. Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier created the most psychologically brutal rivalry in UFC history, with hatred so deep and personal that it turned press conferences into therapy sessions and fights into attempts at mutual destruction. Their hatred wasn't based on competition or money, it was rooted in fundamental differences in character and morality. Cormier saw Jones as everything wrong with the sport, while Jones saw Cormier as a self-righteous hypocrite. The personal nature of their attacks was unprecedented in the UFC. Jones would attack Cormier's masculinity, his achievements, and even his family, while Cormier would attack Jones's character and his repeated legal troubles. Their first press conference brawl showed that their hatred was real and uncontrollable. These weren't two professionals putting on a show. These were two men who genuinely wanted to hurt each other. The psychological warfare between them was brutal. Jones knew exactly how to get under Cormier's skin, while Cormier's moral superiority complex drove Jones to levels of cruelty that shocked even his supporters. When they fought, the hatred was evident in every exchange. Jones wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to break Cormier's spirit and prove his superiority in the most humiliating way possible. The aftermath of their fights was even more brutal than the fights themselves. Jones's celebrations were designed to maximize Cormier's humiliation. Cormier's responses showed genuine emotional damage. What made this rivalry so compelling was how personal it became. They attacked each other's character, family and legacy in ways that went far beyond professional competition. The drug test failures and legal issues that surrounded their rivalry added another layer of hatred, with each man using each other's problems as ammunition for their psychological warfare. The Jones-Cormier feud showed that the most intense hatred comes from fundamental differences in values and character, creating conflicts that can never truly be resolved. Chael Sonnen versus Anderson Silva. Chael Sonnen and Anderson Silva created a rivalry based on complete disrespect and cultural warfare, with Sonnen's trash talk being so personal and offensive that it turned the normally calm Silva into a man seeking violent revenge. Sonnen's attacks on Silva weren't just about fighting, they were attacks on his country, his culture, his family, and everything he represented. The personal nature of the disrespect created hatred that went beyond anything seen before. Silva, who was known for his respect and sportsmanship, was genuinely offended by Sonnen's comments about Brazil and his personal life. The hatred in Silva's eyes during their press conferences was unmistakable. Sonnen's psychological warfare was designed to get under Silva's skin and make him fight emotionally instead of technically. The strategy worked, but it also created genuine hatred that made their rivalry intensely personal. The first fight showed just how much Sonnen's trash talk had affected Silva. For 4.5 rounds, Silva looked like a man who was being broken by someone he genuinely despised. Silva's comeback submission victory wasn't just a win, it was revenge against someone who disrespected everything he held dear. The way he celebrated showed that this was deeply personal. The build-up to their rematch was even more intense, with Sonnen continuing his disrespectful campaign and Silva responding with barely controlled rage that was frightening to witness. When Silva knocked out Sonnen in the rematch, it was the culmination of years of built-up hatred and the ultimate revenge against someone who'd crossed every line. What made this rivalry so compelling was the cultural aspect. Sonnen's attacks on Brazil and Silva's heritage created hatred that went beyond individual competition. The Sonnen-Silva feud showed that disrespect and cultural insensitivity could create hatred that was just as intense as any personal beef between fighters. Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal. Colby Covington and Jorge Masvidal were roommates, training partners, and best friends who became the most bitter enemies in the UFC when money and fame destroyed their brotherhood. Their hatred's so real that it spilled over into actual criminal charges. These two men lived together, trained together, and supported each other through the hardest times of their careers. They were like brothers who had each other's backs no matter what, until success changed everything. The friendship started falling apart when Colby adopted his controversial persona and began making statements that Jorge found personally offensive. Started as a character became something that Jorge saw as the betrayal of their friendship. Jorge felt that Colby had sold out their friendship and their community for fame and money. The personal nature of Colby's attacks on Jorge's family and background turned professional competition into something much darker. The hatred reached its peak when Colby started talking about Jorge's family and personal life in ways that crossed every line. Jorge's response was to promise real violence that went beyond anything that could happen in the octagon. When they finally fought at UFC 272, the animosity was so intense that it felt like watching two men trying to end each other's careers. Every punch was thrown with genuine malice and intent to cause lasting damage. The post-fight incident where Jorge allegedly attacked Colby at a restaurant showed that their hatred extended far beyond professional competition. This was personal in a way that threatened to destroy both their careers. What made this rivalry so compelling was the betrayal aspect. These weren't strangers who developed hatred. These were best friends whose relationship was destroyed by fame and money. The criminal charges that followed their feud showed just how real their hatred had become. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was two men whose friendship had turned into something genuinely dangerous. The Covington-Masvidal feud represents the dark side of success in the UFC, showing how fame and money can destroy even the strongest friendships and create hatred that goes beyond sports. Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate. Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate created the most intense female rivalry in UFC history, with hatred so personal and bitter that it elevated women's MMA while showing that female fighters could hate each other just as intensely as men. Their hatred started on The Ultimate Fighter, where their different personalities and coaching styles created immediate conflict. Rousey's arrogance clashed with Tate's determination in ways that created genuine animosity. The personal nature of their attacks was unprecedented in women's MMA. Rousey would attack Tate's fighting ability, her appearance, and even her relationship, while Tate would attack Rousey's character and attitude. Their coaching rivalry on TUF showed that their hatred extended beyond just wanting to fight each other. They genuinely couldn't stand being in the same room and wanted to prove their superiority in every way possible. The psychological warfare between them was brutal, personal. Rousey's dismissive attitude toward Tate created genuine hatred that was evident every time they interacted. When they fought, the hatred was obvious in every exchange. Rousey wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to humiliate Tate and prove that she was superior in every way. The aftermath of their fights was just as intense as the fights themselves. Rousey's celebrations were designed to maximize Tate's humiliation, while Tate's responses showed genuine emotional damage. What made this rivalry so compelling was how it elevated women's MMA. Their genuine hatred created interest in drama that helped establish the women's divisions as legitimate draws. The personal nature of their conflict showed that female fighters could create just as much drama and hatred as their male counterparts. counterparts, breaking down barriers and stereotypes. The Rousey-Tate feud proved that women's MMA could produce rivalries that were just as intense and compelling as anything in the men's division. Nick Diaz versus BJ Penn. Nick Diaz and BJ Penn represented two different worlds colliding. Gritty streets of Stockton versus the laid-back beaches of Hawaii, and their mutual disrespect created a hatred that was rooted in completely different philosophies about fighting and life. Diaz saw Penn as a privileged rich kid who had everything handed to him, while Penn viewed Diaz as a disrespectful punk who didn't understand what it meant to be a true martial artist. Their clash was cultural as much as it was personal. The hatred between these two was evident every time they spoke about each other. Diaz would talk about Penn's privileged background with genuine disgust. Penn would dismiss Diaz as someone who lacked respect for the sport. When they finally fought, the animosity was palpable. Diaz's relentless pressure and trash talk during the fight showed that he wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to break Penn's spirit and prove his superiority. Penn's corner throwing in the towel wasn't just a tactical decision. It was the moment when Hawaii's golden boy was broken by Stockton's grittiest warrior, and the hatred in Diaz's celebration was unmistakable. The post-fight interviews revealed just how deep their mutual disrespect ran. Neither man showed any respect for the other, and their comments made it clear that this wasn't just about competition. What made this rivalry so compelling was the class warfare aspect. Diaz represented the working-class fighter who had to scrap for everything, while Penn represented natural talent and privilege. Their different approaches to training, fighting, and life created a philosophical divide that went way beyond just wanting to win fights. They genuinely believed the other represented everything wrong with the sport. The hatred between Diaz and Penn showed that sometimes the most intense rivalries come from fighters who represent completely different worlds and values. This feud proved that cultural and class differences could create hatred that was just as intense as any personal beef between fighters. Wanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen. Wanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen created a rivalry based on national pride and personal disrespect, with Silva's Brazilian rage clashing with Sonnen's American arrogance in ways that create genuine hatred and real-world consequences. Sonnen's attacks on Brazil and Brazilian fighters were just trash talk to Silva. They were personal insults to his country, his culture, and everything he represented as a Brazilian fighter. Silva's response to Sonnen's disrespect was pure rage. The normally articulate fighter became so angry that he could barely speak English, showing just how deeply Sonnen's comments had affected him. The hatred between them was so intense that it led to real-world confrontations. Silva's attempt to confront Sonnen at a hotel showed that their rivalry had moved beyond professional competition. Sonnen's continued disrespect to Brazilian fighters and culture created hatred that went beyond individual competition. Silva saw himself as defending his entire country's honor. The personal nature of their conflict was evident in every interaction. Silva genuinely wanted to hurt Sonnen for what he saw as unforgivable disrespect to his homeland. Their scheduled fight fell apart due to various issues, but their hatred remained real and intense. Silva's comments about wanting to hurt Sonnen showed that this was deeply personal. What made this rivalry so compelling was the cultural warfare aspect. Sonnen's attacks on Brazil created hatred that was rooted in national pride and cultural identity. The intensity of Silva's rage showed that some lines shouldn't be crossed. Disrespecting someone's country and culture could create hatred that was genuinely dangerous. The Silva-Sonnen feud demonstrated that cultural and national pride could create hatred. It was just as intense as any personal beef between individual fighters. Ken Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz. Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz created a rivalry based on generational conflict and personal disrespect, with the old lion clashing with the young wolf in ways that created genuine hatred and multiple violent confrontations. Their hatred started when Ortiz began disrespecting Shamrock and the older generation of fighters. Shamrock saw Ortiz as a disrespectful punk who didn't understand what the pioneers had sacrificed. Ortiz viewed Shamrock as a washed-up has-been who was trying to hold back the new generation. The generational conflict created personal animosity that went beyond professional competition. The personal nature of their attacks was brutal. Ortiz would attack Shamrock's age and declining abilities, while Shamrock would attack Ortiz's character and lack of respect. Their confrontations outside the octagon showed that their hatred was real and uncontrollable. The backstage incidents and public confrontations proved this wasn't just promotion. When they fought, the hatred was evident in every exchange. Both men were trying to prove their superiority and settle years of built-up animosity. The multiple fights between them showed that their hatred couldn't be resolved with just one confrontation. Each fight only added more fuel to their ongoing feud. What made this rivalry so compelling was the father-son dynamic. Shamrock represented the old guard, while Ortiz represented the new generation, creating natural conflict. The intensity of their hatred showed that generational conflicts and fighting could be just as personal and bitter as any other type of rivalry. The Shamrock-Ortiz feud demonstrated that respect for pioneers and veterans was a serious issue that could create genuine hatred when it was lacking. Matt Hughes versus Frank Trigg. Matt Hughes and Frank Trigg created a rivalry based on regional pride and personal disrespect, with their Midwest backgrounds creating a hatred that was rooted in who could claim to be the toughest man from America's heartland. Their hatred started with Trigg's disrespect of Hughes' wrestling background and rural upbringing. Hughes saw this as an attack on his identity, and everything he represented. Trigg viewed Hughes as an overrated wrestler who couldn't handle real striking. The technical disagreement became personal when they started attacking each other's backgrounds. The personal nature of their conflict was evident in their trash talk. Hughes would attack Trigg's toughness and heart, while Trigg would attack Hughes' limited skills and boring style. Their first fight showed the intensity of their rivalry. Hughes' dominant wrestling performance was designed to prove his superiority and humiliate Trigg. The rematch created one of the most iconic moments in UFC history when Hughes slammed Trigg unconscious. The violence of that finish showed just how much Hughes wanted to hurt his rival. What made this rivalry compelling was the regional aspect. Both men represented different versions of Midwest toughness and wanted to prove their superiority. The intensity of their hatred was evident in how personal their attacks became. They weren't just fighting for wins, they were fighting for respect and regional pride. The Hughes-Trigg feud showed that regional rivalries could create hatred that was just as intense as any other type of conflict between fighters. If you like learning about these crazy UFC fights and rivalries, hit subscribe for more videos like this.